Okay? Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to my presentation on the Vikings, Conquest by Design. Um, the image on the screen that I'm giving you presents the image which is most commonly associated with the Vikings. Let's say that the only thing that I don't have here are those little horns on the helmets that you're supposed to see. But actually, I think it also could represent a group of cruisers getting out of a tender and getting on shore at the same, a little sympathy there. And a day like today, I think everybody can appreciate what it must have been like 1,000 years ago riding around in the North Atlantic in a Viking ship, and imagine the kind of people they must have been. But anyway, my title refers to design, and what does design have to do with the Vikings, and what does design have to do with what we think about the Vikings? Well, first of all, the premise of the Vikings as marauding raiders is somewhat true, but not totally true. And the reason it's not totally true is because the Viking story is basically told to us by people who were not Vikings, people who had a point of view that they would prefer to express. The Viking era is claimed to have begun in 793. Now we have very, very rarely do we have an exact date for the beginning of an era of a people. But in the Vikings' case, we do, because we have an eyewitness account of their attack on this monastery in Lindisfarne, which was very close to where we were yesterday. The eyewitness account, of course, was written in Aachen, Germany, which is 450 miles away, and so obviously it's not to be trusted. And someone asked me earlier today, what's the story with the Vikings? Did they just get started on this because they were bored? And basically, the history of the Vikings is still a story that is unfolding. For some reason, there's a lot of people who don't want to give the Vikings much credit for much of what they did. And I don't really understand all the politics of that, but there is apparently politics involved. But the Norsemen, or the Vikings, which basically were referring to the people of Finland, Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, these people were actively involved in living and trading long before 700 AD, and apparently getting along just fine with their neighbors in Northern Europe. But something occurs in 793 and the story changes. Well, if you look at the timeline in history, you'll discover that 793, something is happening in France, and that is Charlemagne is trying to reorganize all of the provinces of Europe again to reconstruct the Roman Empire. We live in an era where Europe has restructured itself into a European Union, and it's a similar kind of a moment. Europe, ever since the fall of Rome, has never been the same as it was while Rome ruled Europe. And on one hand, Europe hates the idea of a unified Europe, and on the other hand, they realize that all the good times that Europe had were associated with when they were working together. So, in the case of Charlemagne, he becomes extremely agitated with any people that are not Christian. And he begins to molest them and send his soldiers out to do whatever they can. And in fact, the Viking era may have begun because of the fact that they were being provoked and just trying to protect themselves against the raiders that Charlemagne was sending into Viking areas with the idea of trying to convert them to Christianity. Anyway, 793, the Vikings stage a raid on Lindisfarne. What is Lindisfarne? Lindisfarne is one of those monasteries that was established in the end of the Roman Empire, on the rim of the Roman Empire, and they are credited in modern times with being one of the reasons that we know so much about the ancient world and why so many of the ideas of the ancient world came forward. Because when Rome stopped responding to these monasteries, the people in the monastery said, what do we do? And the abbots would say, well, what were we doing yesterday? And they said, well, we're working on the books. They say, well, let's keep doing it. The Romans will come back. They must come back. We don't know where they went, but they'll come back. So this literally went on for a couple of hundred years. And in fact, to this day, the oldest known Bible that exists in the world is handed down to us from Northumberland. Many of the historic information that we have of both the Greeks and the Romans is the gift of these monasteries. But these monasteries are not famous for their military prowess. So the Vikings discovered this was a fabulous way of getting even with Charlemagne. One, you could break up his Christian cult. Two, there was a lot of gold and silver and other items of value in these monasteries. So it seemed to be a very good idea to begin to explore invading and conquering these little enclaves. Now, the Vikings come to us from this area in the North Atlantic, all these countries, as I've already stated. Now, what very few people realize is that the role that they play starts before their interest in conquest and continues long after they're written off. The English managed to convince the world that the Viking era came to an abrupt end in 1066. So we have a beginning date of 793, and it's over in 1066. Well, I'm going to attempt to point out that that's not quite true. Okay? So anyway, the Vikings' first gift is their ships. And as you can see here, a Viking ship is a rowing vessel with a sail attached. But something about the Viking ships that to separate them apart from other vessels is the fact that it enabled them to connect between the little islands and fjords. You remember yesterday we had the tender so far in? Well, a Viking boat could go right up to the shore. It only needed 2.5 feet of water. It could carry 100 men and only took up 2.5 feet of water. So it was good on a river, it was good in the ocean, and it enabled them to build houses and support colonies in different places and connect between each other in this particular part of the world where the water isn't always as deep as you want it to be. Now, the kind of houses the Vikings built, when I was in college, they would point out these houses and say how crude and primitive they are. But today, we actually realize how smart they are. They dug down into the ground and then built on top and covered it with ground. Today, we call that a green roof. And underground like that, we call that thermal protection. All right, so that they weren't as, perhaps maybe not as dumb as they seemed. They would just plant the ground right back up on top of the roof, and it enabled them to live in these homes in really very harsh climate with a good deal of success. Another feature of a Viking home is that if you notice, there doesn't seem to be windows or rooms, but rather there's an entrance, and then there's this big roof. And so they're all kind of similar in that sense. So they use the stone, which you've noticed yesterday in Scotland, there's a lot of it around here, to build the exteriors. Then they cover it with the ground, which continues to grow, keeps it fresh, and keeps the water out. And they create these interior spaces with these openings on the top. These are not really chimneys. They're openings on the roof. They don't go down like a chimney goes down. They're outlets. And what that would enable them to do is they have these big spaces, as I'm showing you here, and then this is actually the ruins of one without its roof, so you can get a sense of that bigness of the size. And then inside that space, there's no walls. It's wide open, and it allows for a lot of people to be living in one building. And the openness, they'd have an open fire in the center, and that would rise, and those vents would take the smoke out. So they had fresh air coming in and smoke going out. The houses were surprisingly warm. Nobody in their era had such a warm and comfortable home as the Vikings had built. Now we know that because we actually have rebuilt them and discovered that they're surprisingly comfortable inside. All right? The other feature is that they live in this sense of openness here, not all quartered off into little rooms. You know, in the monasteries, the way the monasteries get their name is they have those cells, little boxes into them, right? And this is very different than what the Vikings are doing. This is what it would look like inside the Viking home, and that fire's here, but the smoke would rise and go out those vents. So it would create a kind of ambient warmth and allow for the people to endure a long, cold winter without a lot of suffering. Another feature of the Vikings is something that gets handed down to England today, and that is, this is a yearly event. You're seeing a recreation here, where the chief of the tribe and all the people of the tribe would come to a single spot, and then all the laws are read aloud. After they're read aloud, people are allowed to petition, to have arguments settled, to have divorces dealt with, etc. Now, the Vikings called this a thing. It's the closest thing to what takes place in a parliament or a congress today. And this was a feature of the Viking civilization, and I have to also point out that women could appear at the thing and make a petition. They could appeal for a divorce. They had equal rights when it came to that. And in fact, women were allowed to go on fighting raids if they agreed to do the same thing that the men would do. So long before anyone else in Europe was thinking about equal rights, the Vikings had already settled the issue. They decided that it was, if the woman could agree to do what the man was doing, she could go and do everything the same way. Now, in a Viking family, a woman, if she decided that she wanted to divorce her husband, she merely had to announce that she was divorcing him and put his things out of the house. And he had to move back to his mother's home or go to some other house, all right? Slightly different than the way it was being conducted in a lot of other places. So there is some interest to my read that the rights of women are already being accounted for in this culture. Now, the idea that every year, every law is clearly stated also allows for them to say, well, that law seems like it doesn't work anymore. What can we do about it? And that opens up a discussion point. Another factor of the Viking society is that they developed layered clothing. And they understood from this cold climate that the more layers you had, the better off you were. And so they developed layered clothing, and this is a typical outfit that you would find of a woman dressed in a Viking community. And this is a reenactment of a father presenting his daughter as a possible marriage subject. But what you can see here are some of the clothing that they wore. This jacket that he's wearing is waterproofed. They developed a way of waterproofing the leather by rubbing wax into the hide. And they, as I said, they wore layered clothing, and so you get this sense that the heat is trapped inside by all these different layers. They also, for ocean voyages, had fur. Obviously, they were using seal and bear and other animals to create fur coats. And a parka, a hooded outfit that they could ride in their boats and stave off the cold and the rain. Waterproof shoes, another one of their features. They made shoes, treated the leather so that their feet could stay dry even though they were walking in wet places. And we know that because we actually have discovered these things. in Viking ruins, and we've been able to see what they were wearing and what they were doing. And let me, at this point, also indicate that life in Europe after Rome fell was not bad. It was awful. Food was terrible. Disease was rampant. The average age of a person living in Great Britain at that time would have been 35 years of age. That they would have been lucky. But we find all the time skeletons of Vikings in their 70s and 80s. And the reason for that is the fact that they had developed a way of living in their world that was superior to their surroundings. This is a bucket, a Viking bucket, more than 1,000 years old. Look at the exquisite workmanship of the metal and the wood here. And then this down here, again, an example of the Vikings' craft. They were exquisite metal workers, and they were able to do things with their metal. And their most famous piece of metal is their sword. Their sword was twice as strong as the metal of the swords that the English and French opponents would use, and would frequently, when struck by a Viking sword, their sword would just break. And the Viking swords, they had their steel came, actually the casting method came from the Middle East. We don't exactly understand how it got to them, but the only supposition we have is that the Vikings were using the rivers that came up from Constantinople, and they had some contact with metallurgy that was superior to Northern Europe. So anyway, they were excellent metal workers in every regard, as well as, look at the woodwork on this sled, and I'm going to show you a little bit more. This is all carved oak. Amazing workmanship. And this is the sled itself. This is a utilitarian object. This is not something the king was riding around in. This was something that a proud person was using on a daily basis. But they took pride in what they were making, and the woodworking skills are extraordinary. A detail of all that carving. One of the other things that characterizes the Vikings is this incredible design sensibility, this rhythmic pattern, twisting, undulating. If you look at it, it almost looks Chinese. You know, like the Chinese bronzes have that same kind of complexity to them. Another example of Viking woodmanship. These are all obviously for use in snow, so they have sledded devices. And here is a wheeled device. And these, as I said, are more than 1,000 years old, and were discovered in these were discovered in Norway, and they're on exhibit in the museum, the Viking Museum in Norway. Now, this is a critical piece of Viking equipment. This is a box that they would have had this box, and it would have gone with them onto the Viking ships. All of the things they needed would be in the box, and it would sit in the floor of the ship, and they would sit on this box, and it would be their seat. And if they needed a jacket, it was in the box. If they needed some other tools, it was in the box. And when they landed, they could take the box with them as a kind of carry-all. Here's another example of a Viking box. More of their metal work. This would have been a brooch for tying a jacket together. More of their metal work. Exquisite craftsmanship, casting, and inlays. It's really quite remarkable. Now, this helmet doesn't have the little horns. It is the only example of a Viking helmet that we have. It's the only one. And it has no horns. Where did those horns come about? Well, it turns out that a publicity department in 1940s in New York added those horns for a promotion, and it caught on like wildfire, and people like to think that the Vikings had those horns. But here's the Viking sword in its scabbard, and here we have with it out. And as I said, the Viking sword was an extraordinary piece of equipment, and they would often have their name written on the sword. And when a Viking would die, they would bend the sword and bury it so that it couldn't be used against him in the afterlife. Now, I want to talk just very briefly about what we know about the religious beliefs of the Vikings. The Vikings believed that the day you were born, your day of death was determined. So you had nothing in life to fear. You were destined to die, but when you would die was not up to you. It was already written into your DNA. Now, I think that's an idea about a certain kind of destiny that we really don't lose here in Northern Europe. During the Reformation, that becomes one of the ideas that a lot of the Reformation writers are actually talking about, this idea of destined. You're destined to a certain kind of life, and it's visible, it's apparent, the idea that an evil person is going to be obvious, and a good person, if you keep your home and you paint your fence, you obviously are a good person, and that's by destiny. God takes care of those people that he is destined for greatness and for goodness. And this finds its roots in the Viking thinking. A Viking soldier, essentially, is a farmer on Tuesday and a fighter on Friday. So he's got his toolbox. If he's called to fight, he just gets what he needs and changes out his tools and goes to the task. The key to the Viking success also is their diet. They had the best diet of their time. It was varied. And that's also one of the reasons that they were constantly on the road in search of places to go, trade, or raid. And that was the deal with the Vikings. You either traded or you got raided. They offered you an opportunity on either side. But one of their interests was keeping that diverse diet well informed and well supplied. And their diet, how do we know so much about their diet? Their teeth. We do DNA checking on their teeth, and we've discovered that they held on to their teeth really well compared to their English and French counterparts. And that we know their Viking teeth because you can tell from the way when you're a young person and you're drinking water, there are clues in the water that you're drinking that get left in your teeth. So 1,000 years later, you can analyze the teeth and determine whether you came from Scandinavia or you came from Italy, because there are certain metals and minerals in our drinking water that get imparted to us. So anyway, the Vikings had a good diet, and it helped them in their quest. Now, the Vikings' other success comes from the fact this is an old tapestry, but what they're making here are ships. And that's where the secret weapon of the Vikings is the ship. They were the best shipbuilders since the ancient Romans. Nobody could touch them on the ocean. They understood something about shipbuilding that had long, long been forgotten, or maybe not known in the ancient world. And that was the fact that a ship needs to be able to give and resist at the same time. So this centerpiece here pushed out against the water. And if you notice the boards, they're lapped. So they cut the wood. They learned that if you split the wood, it's stronger than if you saw the wood. So they split the wood, overlapped it, and then joined it with steel nails. Then the nails are covered with caulking, and then the ship is held together by the pressure of the water against this centerpiece here. And the boat is very, very supple and will bend and move across the surface of the water. Now, they're reconstructing them here. You can see that what I showed you in the drawing is being revealed here in 3 dimensions in wood. And this is the exterior of one of the Viking hulls. As I said, these heavy nails are driven in and bent over on the other side, and it's a lap. Looks a little bit like siding on a house, the way they've done it. But it worked really well because there's a little bit of give as the boat is moving. Fortunately, we've had very calm water, but I've been in this part of the world before, and it's known to move a lot. And the Viking ship just moves across the surface and takes that water rather gently. This is a Viking mound, and these are burial sites. And when we find these, there frequently are ships buried in there with them, and many other things. They've not all been excavated, but in lots of parts of Norway and Denmark, they have dug in and discovered ships and other elements. This is a group of men excavating one of those mounds. This is back in 1906. And this is one of the boats that they found in there. And now, remember that this boat has been buried for more than 1,000 years, but it's, you can still understand how it was built. Now, this structure here is actually like a boathouse. So in a really bad weather, they could get inside of that and get out of the real harsh weather. And then the rest of the time, all those boxes would sit in between these members, and that's where the Vikings would sit to work. Their boats came in different sizes. Some were designed to hold only 3 or 4 people, then others 10, 20, but they built boats that held over 100 people at a time. And their style of movement was basically what they would do is move on. If they were doing a raid, they would move in force, documenting an attack in northern Germany, in Hamburg. 650 Viking ships appeared on the horizon at the same time, all carrying more than 100 fighters. So they were able to just land as the Americans and the Allies at Normandy, just slide right onto the beach and jump off the boats and hit the ground running. A style which really was not used again until World War II with landing craft. You see the hull, again, as I said, they have a very shallow draft here, and then this part is above the waterline. These little ringlets on the side, these holes, that's for the oars, and they could plug these when they were sailing so that there was no water coming in. The Viking ship had no front or back. It was the same front and back. So you never knew whether they were coming or going. But the advantage of that was they didn't have to turn around. They just pushed the boat back in the water and started going. And then they could manipulate